Hello everyone, welcome to Baker Street Tales. I'm aiming to reach 3,000 subscribers by the end of this year, and I believe we can achieve it together. Your support by subscribing would truly mean a lot to me. Now, let's dive into the stories. My neighbor thought he owned the street, so I taught him a lesson. I 36M live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where most people are pretty laid back. It's the kind of place where you wave to your neighbors, borrow a cup of sugar, and maybe gossip over the fence. Everything was fine until Jerry 42 male moved in next door. From day one, I could tell Jerry had this absurd idea that the entire street belonged to him. At first, it was little things. He made snide comments about people parking too close to his driveway or how someone's garden wasn't up to neighborhood standards. But soon, things escalated. I remember the day he started putting cones in front of his house to claim the public parking spaces on the street. I couldn't believe it. If anyone parked there, even for 5 minutes, Jerry would lose his mind. I could hear him yelling from across the street, "You can't park here. This is my space." At that point, I'd had enough. I'm usually easygoing, but there's something about entitlement that just gets under my skin. I decided it was time to show Jerry he didn't own the road. One Saturday, I had a few friends over for a barbecue. When my buddy Sam parked in front of Jerry's house, I could already see Jerry's face turning red from my porch. Within minutes, there he was, pounding on my door, demanding Sam move his car. I calmly explained that it was a public street. Jerry wasn't having it, though. He threatened to tow Sam's car if it wasn't moved. I took a deep breath and smiled, thinking about how I would teach him a lesson. The next weekend, I hatched a plan. I rented a giant inflatable bouncy castle, one that was so massive it could have been the centerpiece of a carnival. I set it up right in front of Jerry's house, taking up 3 parking spaces. I can still picture the way it loomed over his yard. As kids from the neighborhood flocked to bounce around, I felt a rush of excitement. Parents gathered too, chatting and enjoying the sunny day while their kids laughed and played. I couldn't help but glance over at Jerry's house. I could practically see him fuming from the window. Eventually, I noticed him storming out of his house, arms flailing as he approached the bouncy castle. The look on his face was priceless. He began shouting about how it was illegal to set up such a thing in front of his house, claiming I was ruining the neighborhood. I simply waved at him and reminded him of the word public. I could see the frustration boiling over. And just like that, Jerry decided to call the cops. I watched him explain his situation, gesturing wildly as he talked. A few minutes later, 2 police officers arrived, and I couldn't help but smile as they approached me. I explained everything, knowing I hadn't broken any laws. When they turned to Jerry, I could see the look on his face as they gently let him know that there was nothing they could do. As long as I wasn't blocking traffic or creating a safety hazard, I was free to let the kids have their fun. Jerry was left standing there, completely defeated. I felt a sense of triumph as he marched back into his house, slamming the door behind him. From that day on, word spread through the neighborhood about Jerry's parking drama. People began parking in front of his house intentionally, just to mess with him. He never bothered anyone about parking again, and the peace returned to our neighborhood. Sometimes, the best way to deal with entitled people is to show them just how little control they actually have. And I will always remember the sight of that bouncy castle, a symbol of my victory over Jerry's ridiculousness.
Story number 2: The time I accidentally ruined my friend's wedding proposal. I, 26 male, still cringe when I think about this, but I have to share it, if only to remind myself to double-check my texts in the future. My best friend, Mike, 27 male, had been planning to propose to his girlfriend, Sarah, for months. He was completely smitten with her and wanted everything to be perfect for the big moment. Mike had mapped out an elaborate plan to pop the question during a romantic sunset picnic at the park, and I was tasked with setting everything up while he distracted her. On the day of the proposal, I woke up early, practically buzzing with excitement. I had been given specific instructions from Mike, where to lay out the blanket, how to scatter the rose petals just right, and the all-important detail of lighting the candles without setting anything on fire. I envisioned the scene in my head, and it looked absolutely magical. As I arrived at the park, I could feel the anticipation bubbling inside me. I got to work, laying out the blanket, arranging the candles in a perfect circle, and carefully scattering the rose petals like confetti. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over everything, I stepped back to admire my handiwork. It was beautiful, straight out of a romantic movie, and I couldn't wait for Mike and Sarah to see it. As I set up, I was also texting another friend about how Mike was feeling. I wanted to share the excitement but was also a little nervous for him. He had been talking about proposing for weeks, and while I was thrilled for him, I knew he was anxious. Without thinking much about it, I typed out a message, joking about how nervous Mike was and how I hoped Sarah didn't say no. Then, in a classic blunder, I accidentally sent that text to Mike instead of my friend. It hit me like a ton of bricks when I realized what I'd done. I could almost hear my heart drop into my stomach. I immediately felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. What was I thinking? I tried to shake off the panic and hoped he wouldn't read it. Seconds later, my phone buzzed, and it was a frantic call from Mike. I could hear the tension in his voice as he asked me if I really thought Sarah might reject him. I wanted to scream at myself for being so careless. I quickly tried to backpedal and explain that it was just a joke, but as soon as I heard his worried tone, I knew the damage was done. I could practically feel the air thickening with anxiety. When Mike and Sarah finally arrived at the picnic spot, I was standing there with a fake smile plastered on my face, trying to act nonchalant while my stomach churned with dread. Mike looked like he had just stepped off a roller coaster, sweaty and shaky, his face pale against the backdrop of the setting sun. The beautiful scene I had created felt tainted by the panic I had unleashed. As they approached the picnic blanket, I could see Sarah's eyes light up with delight, completely unaware of the tension that was bubbling beneath the surface. I watched as Mike attempted to muster up the courage to get down on one knee. It was painful to see him struggle. The once sweet atmosphere felt charged with uncertainty, and all I could do was stand back and hope for the best. When he finally proposed, I held my breath. I saw the moment Sarah's eyes widened, and then she said yes, throwing her arms around him in pure joy. I wanted to celebrate, but a part of me felt like I had been holding a ticking time bomb that just exploded. Mike later confided in me that my careless text had almost made him bail on the whole thing. That night, as we all celebrated, I couldn't shake off the weight of my mistake. Mike tried to brush it off, laughing about it later, but I could see the look in his eyes. I was so relieved everything had worked out, but I knew my reckless texting had nearly ruined a once-in-a-lifetime moment for my best friend. In the weeks that followed, I learned my lesson the hard way. I vowed to think twice before hitting send on a text, especially when it involved something as serious as a wedding proposal. But I couldn't help but chuckle every time I thought about it, knowing that I had unintentionally created a memory that Mike and Sarah would remember forever, even if it wasn't quite how he envisioned it. Now, whenever I'm in a group chat, I can't help but look back on that day and laugh nervously, grateful that Mike and Sarah are happily engaged, despite my moment of complete idiocy. I still tease Mike about it whenever we talk, reminding him that every great love story has a little drama, even if it comes from a poorly timed text message.
Story 3. My boss tried to make me his personal butler, so I got him fired. I, 22 male, used to work at a marketing agency where the office culture was supposed to be professional and collaborative. But then there was Steve 30M, my boss, who embodied the exact opposite. He was the kind of person who thrived on power and control, and I found myself becoming the unwilling victim of his delusions of grandeur. Every day felt like I was living in a sitcom, only I was the punchline, and it was getting old fast. From day one, Steve made it clear that my job description was more of a suggestion than a rule. Sure, I was hired as a marketing assistant, but he had other plans. It started off harmless enough, with him asking me to get him coffee in the mornings. At first, I thought, okay, it's not a big deal, but then it escalated quickly. He started asking me to run personal errands, like picking up his dry cleaning and even taking his dog to the vet during my lunch break. I could hardly believe it. None of this was in my contract, but Steve had this way of making it seem like refusing would jeopardize my job. I was stuck in this twisted game of power dynamics, and I felt completely powerless. One day, the situation reached a boiling point. Steve had just returned from a weekend getaway with his family, and he had the nerve to ask me to pick up his wife's birthday present, a gigantic chandelier from an upscale store across town. I was seething inside, my patience wearing thin. One day, the situation reached a boiling point. Steve had just returned from a weekend getaway with his family, and he had the nerve to ask me to pick up his wife's birthday present, a gigantic chandelier from an upscale store across town. I was seething inside, my patience wearing thin. Did he really think I was his personal assistant? It was absurd. I tried to keep my cool, but it was getting harder to suppress my frustration. I realized this was the moment I had to take a stand. Instead of complying, I went to the store, but instead of picking up that chandelier, I pulled out my phone and called HR. I explained everything that had been happening, but at first, they didn't seem to care. They brushed it off like it was just a minor inconvenience. I felt defeated, but I wasn't going to let this slide. Steve had crossed the line, and I was done being his errand boy, determined to take action. I decided to gather evidence of Steve's outrageous behavior. I started combing through my emails and texts, documenting each ridiculous request he'd made. The more I collected, the angrier I became. I spent hours organizing everything into a neat little file, detailing each instance where he'd abused his power. I felt like a detective building a case, and I was ready to bring him down. A week later, the company had scheduled a massive meeting that included upper management and all the employees. I saw this as my chance. While everyone was preoccupied with the presentations, I managed to accidentally send the entire file to the whole office. It was a risky move, but I felt a rush of adrenaline as I clicked send. My heart raced as I thought about what might happen next. Within minutes, chaos erupted in the office. People were gasping, whispering, and looking around in disbelief. I could see the shock on everyone's faces as they read through the evidence of Steve's tyranny. The meeting had turned into a scandal, and it was glorious. I watched as Steve's face turned beet red, his eyes darting around the room, realizing that his cover had been blown. It didn't take long for the higher-ups to act. They called Steve into a meeting, and I could only imagine the conversation that was happening behind those closed doors. The tension in the air was palpable, and I felt a sense of vindication wash over me. After what felt like an eternity, Steve was escorted out of the building within 2 days. I couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. It was like watching the villain of a movie get their comeuppance. Although I ended up losing my job a few months later due to budget cuts, I can honestly say that witnessing Steve's downfall was worth it. It felt like justice had been served, and I had finally stood up for myself after enduring so much nonsense. I didn't regret my actions for a second. I had taken my power back, and the memory of seeing Steve's shocked expression as he was shown the door would always make me smile. In the end, I learned that sometimes you have to fight back against the injustices in the workplace. It wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about standing up for what's right. Even though I moved on from that job, the experience taught me that no one should ever let themselves be treated like a personal servant, no matter the circumstances. I've carried that lesson with me ever since, ready to take on whatever life throws my way next.
Story 4: The time my grandma outsmarted a scam artist. I have to tell you about the time my grandma, 82 female, the sweetest little lady you'd ever meet, pulled off a masterclass in outsmarting a scam artist. If you met her, you'd think she was the last person to be able to navigate the world of shady phone calls, but she proved us all wrong in the most hilarious way. One afternoon, my grandma received a call from a guy claiming to be a lawyer. He launched into this dramatic story about how I had been arrested for a DUI and needed $5,000 for bail. Now, my grandma knew better than to take this at face value. After all, I didn't even own a car, and the only thing I was likely to get arrested for was stealing the last piece of pie at family dinners. But being the clever woman she is, she decided to play along instead of hanging up. With a sweet but determined tone, she acted concerned, saying how terrible it was and that she would send the money right away. I could practically picture her scribbling down every detail, her cat, Mr. Whiskers, observing her with a judgmental look as if he knew she was about to pull off something epic. The scammer, probably thinking he had a clueless victim, provided her with all the account information like he was handing over a golden ticket. Feeling quite proud of herself, Grandma wasted no time. She got dressed, put on her best business a cardigan, and marched her way to the local police station. The way she strutted in, you would have thought she was walking onto the set of a crime drama. When she arrived, she presented them with all the information she had gathered, looking like she had just solved a major case herself. The officers at the station couldn't help but chuckle as she recounted the ridiculous tale of the scammer. Grandma was not only handing over the information but also casually critiquing the scammer's lack of creativity. Honestly, if they're going to try to scam someone, at least make it believable. Who thinks a granddaughter with no car is getting a DUI, she said with a twinkle in her eye. A week later, the police tracked down the scammer and arrested him. The satisfaction Grandma felt was palpable, and I could practically hear her cackling in glee from miles away. But the best part? The police were so impressed with her savvy approach that they invited her back to the station to give a statement. Grandma seized the moment and decided to whip up a batch of her famous cookies to bring along. Can you imagine it? The officers, who had just apprehended a con artist, were treated to a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies by my grandma, who had single-handedly brought the scammer to justice. She was a local hero. I can picture her there, smiling brightly, telling the officers how they better save her a few cookies for when they needed a snack during their next stakeout. After all of this, my grandma became something of a legend in our family. Whenever anyone brought up scams or scam calls, I could see her puffing up with pride, eager to share her story. She would casually remind everyone that if a scammer ever tried to mess with her again, they'd better be ready for a fight. She had cookies and a police department behind her. It taught me a valuable lesson: never underestimate the power of a sweet old lady with a sharp mind and a batch of cookies. Grandma proved that you don't have to be tech-savvy or young to outsmart a scammer. All it takes is a little cunning and a lot of sass. Now, every time my phone rings, I can't help but think about how my grandma would handle it. And honestly, I hope one day I can channel her inner savagery when the moment calls for it.
Story 5. My roommate's pet parrot ruined my date, and I got revenge. Hi, my name is Paul, 23 male. Started sharing an apartment with an acquaintance, college mate Jake, 24 male. Living with Jake was always an adventure, but not the kind you'd hope for when you sign a lease with a buddy. He had this obnoxious pet parrot named Chirpy, and let me tell you, that bird was the ultimate gossip. Chirpy had a talent for picking up phrases, and not just any phrases. He was a pro at repeating the most embarrassing ones. I had learned to accept that my life would never be the same with that feathered fiend around, but things took a turn one fateful night that changed everything. One evening, I finally managed to secure a date with a girl I had been crushing on for ages. Let's call her Emily. We had hit it off at a party a week earlier, and I was stoked to have her over. I set the scene perfectly. The lights were dimmed, some soft music played in the background, and I even bought snacks to impress her. I felt like a smooth operator, ready to win her over. Things started out great. We settled down on the couch, talking and laughing as if the world outside didn't exist. But then, out of nowhere, Chirpy decided to join the party. He had been quiet until that moment, like he was waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Suddenly, he screeched at the top of his little lungs, "Paul doesn't wash his hands after the bathroom." My heart sank as Emily's face contorted in horror. I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me, and I was free-falling into the depths of embarrassment. I shot a panicked glance at Chirpy, who seemed to be enjoying his moment of glory far too much. Emily looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. I wanted to crawl under the couch and hide. Instead, she quickly made an excuse about needing to get home, leaving me with a mix of rage and humiliation. After she left, I confronted Jake, but he was doubled over in laughter, completely unbothered by the chaos Chirpy had caused. It was infuriating. I knew I had to get back at both of them for ruining what could have been a great night. I began plotting my revenge, and I decided the best way to do it was to turn Chirpy against Jake. While Jake was at work, I set to work training Chirpy, armed with a list of embarrassing phrases that would make even the toughest guy cringe. Each day, I would come home and teach Chirpy a new phrase. It was a secret mission, and I was loving every minute of it. Jake eats his boogers was a personal favorite, along with Jake wears SpongeBob underwear. I could already picture the look on Jake's face when Chirpy would unleash these gems. A week later, the stars aligned perfectly. Jake decided to throw a get-together with a few friends, completely unaware of the trap I had set. I waited with bated breath, hiding in my room and listening to the laughter echoing through our apartment. I felt like a mastermind as I peeked out to see Jake surrounded by his buddies, showing off his cool parrot. Then it happened. Chirpy, fueled by the energy of the party and my brilliant training, began to mimic the phrases I had taught him. The room fell silent for a moment as he squawked, "Jake eats his boogers." The stunned silence was quickly followed by a roar of laughter. Jake's face turned crimson as he tried to maintain some semblance of composure, but it was too late. Chirpy was just getting started. "Jake wears SpongeBob underwear," chirped the parrot next, and Jake was officially mortified. I could barely contain my laughter from my hiding spot as his friends were in stitches, pointing and teasing him. The embarrassment was palpable, and I reveled in every second of it. Justice had finally been served, and it felt glorious. Jake's friends continued to egg Chirpy on, and each new phrase was met with uproarious laughter, cementing Chirpy's reputation as the life of the party at least for that night. Jake could hardly show his face after the onslaught of humiliation, and I relished in the moment. Watching him squirm was the sweetest payback for all the times he made me feel like a fool. From that day on, Chirpy became a local legend among our friends. Jake learned the hard way that living with a parrot trained for revenge could be a slippery slope. The best part, Chirpy still repeats those embarrassing phrases to this day. Whenever I walk into the room, I'm greeted by the familiar squawking, and it never fails to crack me up. In the end, I didn't just get my revenge. I taught Jake a lesson about respecting personal space and boundaries, especially when it comes to living with someone. Plus, I became a bit of a hero among my friends, known as the mastermind who outsmarted not one, but two nuisances in one fell swoop. I can't wait for the next date, hopefully. I'll remember to keep Chirpy entertained before they arrive. The end.